morning. Welcome to Rogue Agent with James Crossland. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education here at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Professor James Crossland, author of Rogue Agent, From Secret Plots to Psychological Warfare, the Untold Story of Robert Bruce Lockhart, will give us an introduction to this almost forgotten figure who was London's key agent in Moscow during the first half of the 20th century. This is the first biography of Lockhart, which I am very stunned to realize, and James is going to share the lengths he went to bring this rather extraordinary character out of the shadows, drawing on years of research into private papers, top secret documents, and the memoirs and diaries of those who know Lockhart best, including himself. So after James gives a presentation, an illustrated presentation about Lockhart, Dr. Mark Stout, who is a former Spy Museum historian, is going to pose a few questions to James. And among other publications, Mark is the author of World War I and the Foundations of American Intelligence. Now, here is a teaser. When Mark is asking James questions, he's going to ask something about this object. This is a silver box, which is on view here at the Spy Museum in our 5th floor covert action gallery. And this box is the only physical evidence that links Lockhart with Sidney Riley, the ace of spies, who may be known to some of you, and to their 1918 plot against Russia's Bolshevik regime. So now, without further ado, what we've been waiting for, Professor James Crossland. Ooh, nicely done.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And thank you to everyone at SPY. It's been a great couple of days here. And thank you for turning up tonight, Mark. And indeed, thank you, all of you, for coming out this evening to hear some stories from a traveler from across the pond. So, in December 1946, a recently retired Foreign Office official, in his late 50s, slightly overweight, quite ill, and low on money, placed a call to the British ambassador to the Soviet Union, a man by the name of Maurice Peterson, and he asked him for a meeting. The man making this request, Sir Robert Bruce Lockhart, had one favor to ask of Peterson. Get me the paperwork so that I can visit Russia. Or specifically, revisit Russia. Because you see, a couple of decades before 1946, a younger, more energetic, more spry version of Robert Bruce Lockhart was the British diplomatic corps' rising star in Moscow. He was there getting involved in all kinds of dangerous adventures. He was carving out a career. He was establishing himself as an expert intelligence gatherer, particularly when it came to Russian matters. He was falling in love with the woman who had become the muse of his life. So what was this request that he was making to Peterson in 1946? Well, it's an old man asking to retread the stomping grounds of his youth. That was not how the Soviet foreign minister Vyacheslav Molotov saw Lockhart's request. As Peterson tells it, when he went to Molotov and said, oh, you remember this chap Lockhart, this guy, he used to work in Russia decades ago, he'd like to come back, he'd like to see how your revolution's going, how Comrade Stalin's doing, etc., etc. The moment he mentions Lockhart's name, Molotov just stonewalls. He just becomes very intense all of a sudden, very quiet. And he gets a bit nervy. He starts looking around as if someone's watching him. And seconds pass like hours, but then eventually, Molotov, in his very grave tone, says to Peterson, Lockhart is known in the Soviet Union. Request denied. Now, why would one of the most powerful men in the Soviet Union, a man who's a right hand of Joseph Stalin, why would he react this way to the very mention of the name of some lowly British official who hasn't been in Moscow for the better part of 2 decades? What was it about that name, Lockhart, that was imprinted on the Soviet memory and prompted that response? I'm going to answer that question tonight, and in the process, I'm going to take you on a whistle-stop tour through the life and times of a man who, as Amanda mentioned, I've spent the better part of a decade researching. So, 10 years to research one man. I know what you're thinking. Does this guy read slow? Has he got some sort of issue here? That's not it at all. The reason why this took me 10 years is because Robert Bruce Lockhart didn't live one life. He lived a plethora of lives, all of which were very heavily documented because he was, amongst many other quirky character traits, a compulsive writer, a compulsive diarist. So he left quite a paper trail. And as you can see from this list of some of the stuff, just some of the stuff he did, some of the stuff I chronicle in the book, he was a diplomat, he was a journalist, he was a best-selling author, he was a propagandist, he was a habitual womanizer, he was a hard drinker, he was a scoundrel, he was a spy. There's a reason I called the book Rogue Agent. He was a rogue in every sense of the word. And since we all want to get home at some point tonight, and since they need to shut the doors on this place, I'm not going to go through it blow by blow. Instead, I'm going to pick out some of the key points here of his life. I'm going to start with the thing that spooked Molotov so much, the 9 months of Lockhart's life where he makes his name and reputation in Russia as the British agent. Now, this is a spy museum. We all know what agent means, or at least we think we do. Because the thing about that term agent, and this applies today. Today, that term is a little bit more refined. It sort of kind of means something. But back in the day, back when Lockhart's operating, this is a deliberately nebulous term. This is a term that's actually been developed in the 19th century by the British Foreign Office to describe someone who you send to a trouble spot, somewhere where there's some kind of political upheaval. And this person is not a spy, they're not a diplomat, they're not a soldier, but they're a little bit of all of those things. And they're there to gather intelligence, they're there to shake hands, they're there to make friends, they're there to make enemies, they're there to bribe people if necessary, conduct espionage, solve the problem some way or the other. That is the very loose mission brief of an agent. And this is how we got the world's largest and most unmanageable empire. It was generations of young men like this being sent out across the world and just being told, muddle through, sort it out, basically. And that's what Lockhart is told in January of 1918 by no less a person than the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Lloyd George. So why him, and what is his assignment? Well, it's a response to the events that have happened a few months prior, when the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, seized control of Russia. Now, this is the most significant revolution to happen since the French Revolution of the 1790s. But it bears remembering that this is also happening in the context of the greatest war the world has ever seen, a war in which Russia is allied with Britain and France against Germany. You guys haven't turned up yet. There's a few months before American soldiers start turning up. So it's Britain and France against Germany. And Russia is, in theory, an ally. But when the Bolsheviks seize power, that theory is going to be tested. Because the Bolsheviks come to power on a very simple platform, and that is to make peace and to get Russia the hell out of the war because it is destroying the nation. And so Britain and France have a problem. They don't have backup of the Americans yet. They're going to face what is going to turn out to be the final and most decisive year of the First World War. massive German offensive is in the offing, and there's a danger that if the Bolsheviks pull Russia out of that war, all these German troops are going to go over to the Western Front, and it's going to be a bit of a catastrophe. So Lockhart is told, go to Russia and figure out some way to get the Bolsheviks to stay in the war. This significant task, wind back a revolution in the midst of the Great War, is being placed on the shoulders of a man who is barely 30 years old. And his qualifications for this are, he'd worked in Russia as a vice consul. He knows the language very well. Lockhart had a head for languages. He knew Russian, Malay, Czech, German, French. He picked up Russian in 6 months. Absolute bastard. I wish I had that competency. And so he's good with languages, and like anyone who's fluent at languages, he also understands the culture behind that language. He understands the Russians. And other than that, he's got some God-given gifts of tradecraft. He knows how to extract information out of people. He knows how to charm. He's quite perceptive, and he's got a hell of a lot of moxie. But other than that, no training whatsoever. 30 years old, go figure out how to keep Russia in the war. Again, this is how Britain does foreign policy. And it gets worse. When he lands, he gets to Moscow, and within a few weeks, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is signed by the Bolsheviks with the Germans. And that treaty extracts Russia from the war. So from the moment he gets there, his mission is seemingly over. What to do? Well, with the need to keep Russia in the war, he turns to more drastic measures than simple diplomacy. And this is where the world into which Lockhart is being dropped in Russia of 1918 is significant. Because he's not the only foreign agent in Russia at this time trying to figure out what to do about the Bolsheviks. He's joined by this killer's row of rogues and scoundrels and thieves. Chief among whom is Sidney Riley, the incredibly ugly man at the top left corner there, who works for SIS, what becomes MI6. Again, spy museum, you all probably know who Sidney Riley is, the so-called ace of spies, who was anything but. Less known is Riley's compatriot, the bald fella in the middle, Captain George Hill, also of SIS, basically just likes running around blowing things up. That's kind of his MO. He's addicted to blowing things up in Ukraine mainly. He's joined by Captain Francis Cromie, a handsome fellow in the uniform on the far right, Royal Navy, also likes blowing things up. Particularly, he wants to blow up the Russian fleet in the Baltic. That's his MO. Detests communism with a fiery passion. That's the British contingent. But then there's the man, the rather odd-looking man with the glasses in the bottom left below Riley there, the excellently named Xenophon Calamatiano, who works for US intelligence, which sort of kind of doesn't really exist at this point, but Mark can talk more about that because that's his jam, not mine. So he's there as an American intelligence asset, let's call him that. And then Joseph Nulon, over there with the excellent mustache, French ambassador, foaming at the mouth, hatred of communism, and desperately wants the Bolsheviks to be burnt and destroyed. And then finally, down the bottom, last but not least, is Mura Budberg, the woman I mentioned at the top, who becomes the muse of Lockhart's life. He falls passionately in love with Mura. She is a whole other story. She is a seductress, a spy, agent provocateur. She is a fascinating woman. And this brains trust decide that they are going to figure out some way to get Russia back in the war. And I'm going to stress Russia here, not necessarily the Bolsheviks. Bolsheviks have made it very clear they don't want to fight the Germans anymore. But that doesn't mean that Russia can't get back in the war. It just means that some kind of new regime needs to be installed in Russia. And so they come up with this idea to try to basically get rid of the Bolsheviks and return Russia to the way it was before all these revolutions ruined everything. Now, here's the problem. These guys are up against this guy. This is Ion Felix Jasinski, who's just as nefarious and clever as he looks. He's the head of the Cheka, the Soviet successor to the Tsar's Okhrana. He is a lifelong revolutionary. He has spent his life running from spies, living in shadows. He understands this stuff. He understands what intelligence is. He understands what subterfuge is, what espionage is. People on the aforementioned slide, not so much. They're all kind of amateur hour. But this guy is on top of things. And his job is to stop the aforementioned from bringing this happy chap down. So what's the plan for the Western Allies? They've got contacts amongst the Latvian riflemen, an elite brigade of the fledgling Red Army. And they have reason to believe that the Latvian riflemen are ready to turn on the Bolsheviks. They're kind of fed up with this communist experiment. They want their country back. They want out of the war, all these kind of things. And so they being the Western conspiracy, let's call them that, they go to the Latvians and say, look, if you guys turn on the Bolsheviks, we can arrange something where Allied troops can land in the north of Russia, so French-British troops can land in the north of Russia in concert. We can also get other revolutionary groups that are in Russia at this time, because it's not just the Bolsheviks, there's plenty of other revolutionary groups, chief among which are the socialist revolutionaries, who despite being socialists, hate the Bolsheviks. It's confusing. But they are rivals of Lenin. And so they've got Russian allies, do the Westerners, and they're saying, we can bring all this together into one grand plan to bring down Lenin's regime. Now, this is where I really got into the weeds on the research side of things, because most historians who looked at Lockhart, they tend to rely on his memoirs published in 1932 on this, which is a great read, fun book, whole load of nonsense, lots of lies, lots of subterfuge. And his basic line is, I had nothing to do with any of these grand plots to bring down Lenin. But if you compare the memoir to the official report that Lockhart writes when he finally gets back from Russia, writes it for the Foreign Office, then you get a slightly different side of the story. But then if you're a research psychopath like myself and you take it a step further and you find the draft of that report, handwritten draft, handwritten in Lockhart's terribly small, really hard to read writing, you find that in a separate file somewhere buried in the British National Archives. And then if you compare that with his unpublished diaries, again, written in this doctor's handwriting prescription scrawl, there in the Parliamentary Archives at Westminster, when I opened up the box, I was sneezing for the rest of the day because they were so covered in dust, no one had ever looked at them, because his diaries were published in the 1970s, and they're the ones that people use. But when you compare all of these things, and then when you look at what the Cheka said about what happened, plus the letters that old man Lockhart writes to his son about what happened, then you get a pretty full picture of what really transpired. And I spend about 3 chapters in the book picking this apart. So again, we all want to get out of here this evening, so I'm not going to go into great depth. But just to bottom line it, the plot was a complete and total shit show, and it was poorly conceived, and it was known to our friend Ian Felix Jasinski pretty much from the start. He knew exactly what was going on. He knew about the Latvians, and he knew about the Latvians because they worked for the Cheka. It was a completely infiltrated operation from the beginning. And this was the result. First of all, headlines, right? So this makes the papers. This is not something that happens in shadow. This becomes global news. Jasinski, knowing that the plot is in earnest, brings the hammer down on the morning of 30th of August 1918. Cheka dragnet across Petrograd and Moscow rounds up Sidney Riley's network, rounds up members of British intelligence, rounds up the Americans, the French. Our friend Mr. Calamitiano makes a pretty schoolboy error of trying to retreat to the American embassy under the guise of being a tourist who'd lost his passport. Now, what an American tourist is doing in revolutionary Russia in 1918, I don't know. Again, he was not very good at being a spy, and he was arrested as a consequence. Most dramatically of all, the British embassy in Petrograd is stormed and there's a gunfight during which Francis Cromie, the lad with the medals, he gets gunned down. And that's a breach of international law and a major international incident, as you can imagine. As for Lockhart and his lover Moira, well, they are arrested. Lockhart is taken to the Lubyanka, and after that, he gets himself a stay at the Kremlin, which has a reputation at this time as a place from which prisoners do not walk out of. They get buried in the garden instead. So he's in a pretty rough spot. But through a prisoner exchange, and after a good amount of time at the Chekhov's pleasure, he is returned to Britain at the end of 1918. This is where historians tend to forget about Robert Bruce Lockhart. It's almost as if he vanishes off history's pages in 1918. He's written off. This was his moment in the sun, 15 minutes, you're done, carry on. And the reason why is because this is how contemporaries felt about him. These are quotes from Foreign Office files about Lockhart. You know, misbehaving schoolboy, feckless idiot, why did we send this boy to do a man's work, that kind of thing. He's finished, his career's done. But it wasn't at all. Robert Bruce Lockhart was a charmer. He was intelligent. He had nous, he had experience. He knew about Russia. He was a valuable man. And so he gets himself a job after the war, after the First World War, working in Prague for a time. Still as part of the diplomatic corps. That's the first lifeline he's given. But more substantial lifelines are thrown to him later on, and they're thrown to him by these quite influential men. And this is a testament again to how much Lockhart could charm people and earn their trust and impress them. The first man, and a very significant man he impresses, is the man in the top left corner there, Lord Beaverbrook, who is the Rupert Murdoch of this era. Ruthless, press baron, owns most of Fleet Street, owns all the major newspapers, very influential figure politically and in the media. He thinks Lockhart's a genius. In fact, he writes in the 1930s, if it were not for women and wine, Lockhart would be prime minister by now. That's how highly he thinks of him. Slightly hyperbolic, but again, the man is a journalist, so he's gonna tell some fibs. But Lockhart works for Beaverbrook for the Daily Express, pretty big newspaper, works at several other Beaverbrook presses. He gets the scoop of being the first British journalist to interview Kaiser Wilhelm II, or the ex-Kaiser as he is now after the war, pretty big scoop. And he really builds up a career as a pretty credible journalist. In the process, as we all know, journalists, the way they write, he's seen as somewhat of a propagandist, a guy who can spin a narrative. And so he gets the attention of the man beneath Beaverbrook there, Rex Leeper, who runs the British Council, which is basically a state-funded propaganda organization, promotes British values abroad, that kind of thing. And it's in that capacity during the 1930s, as fascism is on the rise, that he ends up working for this very intense-looking fellow over there on the far right, Sir Robert Vansittart, who is the detester-in-chief of the Third Reich in Britain. He hates Hitler, he hates the Germans, he knows war's coming, and he wants to prepare for it. And he establishes this informal network of spies who go to this country, they go across Europe, gathering intelligence on fascism. And Lockhart is actually sent to this very city to gather intelligence on Vansittart's behalf, with the cover of being one of these lecturers for the British Council, one of these people who's going to give a lecture about how wonderful Britain is and how democracy is a great thing. But then after that, he's off whispering to people, gathering rumors. What's going to happen when the war comes with Hitler? Are the Americans going to be on board? Are they going to back us? What's the deal? That's the kind of stuff that he's picking up. And through this mixture of getting back into propaganda, increasing his sort of capabilities as an intelligence gatherer, when the war breaks out, he winds up here, which looks like a damn nice place to end up if you're in war. I mean, he's too old to serve. He's never going to be a soldier. So why not go out to the Bedfordshire countryside, get yourself a manor house? It's dead nice. Problem is, he's in a pretty odd position here at Woburn Abbey, which is near the more iconically and well-known Bletchley Park. He's there with people who he calls freaks, some genuine antiques, several fakes, and a few geniuses. And that's the flattering way in which he describes the coterie of journalists, university lecturers, Whitehall officials, playwrights, poets, various other ne'er-do-wells who are thrown together by the British government at Woburn at the start of the Second World War and told, come up with some propaganda to undermine German morale. And again, this is the British way of doing things. No real specific mission, just here's a problem. You seem like an intelligent person. You went to Oxford, you went to Cambridge. Why don't you go fix it? That's basically the brief. And so they get to Woburn, these people, and what do? Well, they crack open the champagne. Rumor has it that they get carloads of prostitutes to come up from London to entertain them. They don't do a lot of work. And perhaps the best evidence of that is the fact that the very first RAF, Royal Air Force bombing raid of the Second World War doesn't drop bombs, it drops propaganda leaflets over the Third Reich. And these propaganda leaflets are terrible. They have basically a speech of the very bland, uninteresting Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, reprinted in German on one side, and then on the other side, they have, again in German, a personal message to the German person reading it. You do know that Hitler's mad, right? He's a loony. He's gonna be the ruin of Germany. Why don't you turn against him? That'd be good. End this war. That's the extent to which British propaganda is sophisticated at this time. It is a mess, and Lockhart is unimpressed working there. But then as time moves on, the need for an effective propaganda organization is pressing. And so we get the formation of this thing called the Political Warfare Executive, which Lockhart is placed in charge of at the end of 1941 and into 1942. His job is to try to craft what today we would call an effective psychological warfare effort, using fake news, using subversion, using rumors, to try to undermine German morale and boost the morale of people in the occupied territories of Europe. And so they come up with things like this leaflet on the far right there, a simple but effective pictorial depiction. That's London at the top in 1940 after the Blitz, and then that's a German city in 1942. It's making it very clear to the German that the shoe is on the other foot now. You all thought you finished us off with the Blitz. Guess what? Now you're getting blitzed. And it's only going to get worse. Again, visceral stuff. It's the sort of propaganda that's still effective today. Visual aids are always good. The other means by which PWE conducts psychological warfare is via this building, and apologies, this is the best photo I could get of it. It's very blurry and horrible. But this brick monstrosity here, it was called Milton Bryan, and that's a place where these things called research units were set up, which is basically a fake news radio station. There were a ton of these set up by at any one time, there are about a dozen. Overall, there are about 25 or so set up during the war. And what these are is this is again in the Bedfordshire countryside, home counties, England. You have people getting behind the microphone, speaking in German, Italian, French, Czech, whatever it is, into the occupied territories and they're broadcasting these fake radio stations where they're undermining German morale. There's a radio station dedicated to farmers saying, isn't it horrible, life under the Nazis? Doesn't grain and manure cost so much more now than it used to? There's stuff dedicated to workers. Why don't you unscrew a bolt on that machine that's making cannon shells or whatever? That would help us out a lot. That sort of thing. But the most effective of these research units is the one that is used by this man in the bottom left-hand corner behind the microphone, Sefton Delmer, who makes use of the monstrosity above him, this radio tower called the Aspidistra. These are the two big weapons that Lockhart has as the Director General of the Political Warfare Executive. The Aspidistra has the power to override German transmissions. So what that means is that when Joseph Goebbels is on the radio barking about whatever it is he's barking about, you can flip a switch on the Aspidistra, and all of a sudden, if you can get someone doing a good Goebbels impression at Milton Bryan, they can seamlessly come in and take over the broadcast, and all of a sudden start talking about how, Hitler's gone mad, Goering's on morphine, everything's falling apart, don't believe a word I say, I'm Hitler, I can't be trusted, etc., etc. That sort of thing, which they never really did. But you can see the modern resonances here. This is akin to hacking, basically, done 1940s style. And Delmer is the king of using the Aspidistra to broadcast one of the more effective research units. It's a fake news radio program called Gustav Siegfried I, or GS1, in which Delmer assumed the persona of a German patriot, a general, in fact, called the Chief. And the cover for this is that he's alleging that he's broadcasting from within Germany. He's a member of the Wehrmacht, high-ranking. He loves his country. He wants Germany to win. He hates Britain, but he also hates Hitler. So his broadcasts are talking about our wonderful military victories, our brave boys fighting out there, but goddamn these Nazis, they're behind the lines, they're corrupt, they're spending all your money, they're having, midnight orgies with the wives of our brave soldiers, all this kind of lewd stuff that he uses. And it's so effective as a form of psychological warfare that Joseph Goebbels actually believes it's real. And he sends the Gestapo out to find this guy because he thinks that the chief is an actual Wehrmacht officer. And Delmer and Lockhart actually come up with a fun way to end the chief's broadcast. On air, they stage an execution where there's a knock at the door, it gets kicked in, and they rattle, someone fires a machine gun into the microphone, and they act as if the Gestapo have found him and killed him, as a one final sort of psychological jab at the powers that be in Germany. And Lockhart has to go to bat for Delmer many times because he is seen as this very lewd and crude person by the powers that be in Britain. And then a final thing that Lockhart presides over is something called the V for Victory campaign. Everyone has seen this picture of Winston Churchill doing the V for Victory sign. What very few people realize is that that was a psychological warfare gesture. It's born of something called the V for Victory campaign, which starts when a Belgian politician who had fled his country when the Nazis occupied it started broadcasting through one of these research units to the occupied territories saying, I want everyone to, if you're in a cafe and there's Germans around, I want you to tap Beethoven's Fifth, V, Roman numeral. And I want you to chalk little V's standing for victory at Wehrmacht barracks and Gestapo headquarters. I want you to show the Germans that there's this hidden army dedicated to the concept of victory across Europe. And what do you know? It takes off. There's little V's everywhere. And again, Himmler completely loses his mind and starts sending his boys out to try to figure out where this is coming from. And it's all coming from the political warfare executive. And when Churchill gets in on the act, given it all that, that's when the Nazis really panic because they're like, oh my God, Churchill's in on this as well. He's sending a signal to the hidden V army, all this kind of stuff. These are just some examples of the weird and wacky and wonderful things that Lockhart presides over as head of the political warfare executive. In many ways, it's a rehabilitation for him, the fact that he is able to turn PWE into what is sometimes referred to as the fourth arm of the British Armed Services, along with the Navy, Air Force, and the Army. Now, that's perhaps overstating the matter. Just like today, it's very hard to assess the effect of propaganda. But what we do know is that he gave it the best shot he could. And by the war's end, he gets knighted for his efforts, both with PWE. He's knighted in 1943 for his efforts with PWE and for his service in Russia in 1918. He is an exhausted man, as I said in the intro. By the time we get to the end of the Second World War, he is sick. His lifetime of drinking too much whiskey, staying out too late is starting to catch up with him, as it does us all when we reach a certain age. He wants to retire to the countryside, write books, and be left the hell alone. But this is a guy who is an expert in propaganda and Russia, and it's the start of the Cold War. So he doesn't get to retire. He doesn't get to just walk off. He is pulled back into the maw by people like Anthony Eden, who's eventually going to become prime minister, saying to him, look, can you tell us about this Stalin guy? Give us a psychological profile. What's his jam? What do we need to think about? CIA ask him for advice on their fledgling psyops against Russia. He does training for other intelligence services around in Britain. He works for the BBC, broadcasting propaganda into Czechoslovakia after it is taken over by the Soviets in a coup in 1948. He keeps working despite himself because the situation demands a man of his talents, a man of his experience. And this chapter of his life, as I say, is pretty much undocumented. Well, it is undocumented until I wrote this book. It's both a triumphant end in some ways, because it is a rehabilitation, it's an affirmation of his skills, of his expertise, but it's also quite bittersweet, because by this stage he's failing in health, his mind is starting to fail him, he's got the early stages of Parkinson's creeping in, and by the time we get to 1970, he dies. Pretty good run for a man who never looked after himself, who always burnt the candle at both ends. But regardless, it is a run that I think needs rehabilitating, needs putting out there. When he dies, the newspapers are flooded with stories of how this man was the British agent in Russia, stories of his exploits in 1918. There's no mention made of anything else that he did. But I'm hoping that I got this across in the book, and I'm hoping that I got this across to you all this evening, that Robert Bruce Lockhart was always more than simply Britain's agent. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much for a great talk. I feel like the sign of a good book project is when you run across a potential topic and you realize, oh my God, why has no one ever written this before? And you're clearly onto that, and congratulations and well done. And really, actually, it is a tremendously good read, as opposed as in addition, rather, to being very insightful and uncovering all kinds of things. So a few questions here before we sort of open it up, and I may jump in during that. But I guess I have to start with a kind of stereotypical, we're historians here, question of how did you get onto this topic?
So I did an intelligence history course when I was an undergrad, about 182 years ago, and it was just a case study. I think one week there was this thing about the Lockhart Plot. You know, it was assessing a fiasco, basically. And I found the story is fascinating. I mean, it's an absolute killer story. There's a reason why the lecturer chose it as a case study. And it stuck in my head. And then when it came time for me to do my PhD, my PhD was on a completely different topic. But I was reading a book about the political warfare executive, which, again, needs a proper book written about it, because this book was terrible. But it had a footnote in it, and it said, it mentioned Robert Bruce Lockhart, and it said, oh, and he was the director of PWE. And I was like, hang on, that's the 1918 kill Lenin guy. What's going on? And I asked my supervisor about it, and he said, oh, yeah, there's a book there, but I'm too old and fed up to write it, so maybe one day you'll write it. And there it is.
Cool. If I can offer a suggestion, I think you need to pitch a TV series. Actually, I think you need to pitch 2 TV series, one on Lockhart, and then a second one with an overlapping cast about his mistress, Mara.
My agent is ahead of you.
Aha.
But I
This was not.
you know, the Netflix bubble and the streaming bubble has burst, I'm told. So I'm not sure they're commissioning series, but hope springs eternal. There's a story there.
I don't know. Is it possible, Amanda, to get back to the cigar box slide? Yeah. So you mentioned this cigar box given by Riley to Lockhart. And, of course, since I work very part-time now, but I work at the International Spy Museum, I wanted to look at the footnote and see if you properly acknowledged the Spy Museum, because surely you saw it here. And I was kind of incensed when I got to the end notes, actually. But then I actually read what you had written, and you'd found a photo of it in the records. So first off, I'm hoping we can have copies of that document and that photograph that you found, if you've got them, because it'd be great for us. But also, do we know anything about the circumstances? How did Riley, alleged ace of spies, come to be giving this kind of incriminating thing to?
Yep, I know precisely the circumstances. So, addendum to the plot and its fallout, I mentioned that Lockhart and Murat are arrested. Riley, luck of the devil, is not. He escapes Russia after fleeing through several safe houses and shacking up with various women who help him out, charmer that he was. He gets back to Britain actually before Lockhart is released. And it's hilarious. They are all under sentence of death. They're tried in absentia, these conspirators, in 1918. They're told, if you step foot on Russian soil again, you will be shot, which, spoiler, Riley does in 1925. But before that, so with that threat of death hanging over them, Lockhart arrives back in Britain, having narrowly avoided, getting double tapped at the Kremlin, and Riley sends him a letter and says, "Oh, when are we going back? The fight against the Reds must continue, etc., and all this stuff." And in these letters, and these letters are at the Hoover Institution, which is where the photograph of this is from as well, in Lockhart's papers, and he says, we need to get back there. And Lockhart says, "You're a madman. We're not doing that." And then a year passes, and it's in December of 1919 that they hold this thing called the liquidation lunch, which is where the conspirators, those who survived, get together for a lunch at, I think it's the Savoy. It's Riley's favorite hotel. Doesn't skimp, Sidney Riley. Not a cheapskate, in London, and it's there that he gives him this box.
Thank you for that. That's, I think, more than we knew, so I appreciate that. One thing that really strikes me reading this book is like the humanity of this guy. You really get a sense of this guy and his many qualities, admirable, not so admirable, and strange. Pursuant to which, for reasons of time, you didn't have a chance to talk about his earlier life, but can you maybe talk a little bit about his life in Southeast Asia, in Malaya, I believe, and sort of what happened there? Because this was, I think, pretty remarkable.
Well, Lockhart was the product of two quite well-to-do Scottish families, the Lockharts and the McGregors. And when you're the product of a well-to-do British family in this period, when you reach a certain age, around about 19 or so, you get sent off to the colonies to make your fortune. And that's what happens to Lockhart. He gets sent to Malaysia. He's put in charge of a rubber plantation. His grandmother is known as the Rubber Queen of Edinburgh. And he's put in charge of this plantation. He said, go make us a lot of money. Instead, he spends his days drinking gin and tonics to ward off malaria.
As one does, yeah.
Obviously, that's purely medicinal. Bullseyeing rats with a pistol on his bungalow. They infest his bungalow. He teaches the locals how to play rugby. I'm not sure they wanted to know how to play rugby, but he does teach them. He seduces a Malaysian princess, just for the hell of it. And in so doing, incurs the wrath of the local sultan, who she's a ward of the sultan. Then he contracts malaria, damn near dies of it, and is invalided home. And the punchline to this is he doesn't make a penny. He somehow loses money on a rubber plantation in the middle of a global rubber boom. It's a misadventure on an enormous scale, but it sets in train the sort of general vices of his life. As you say, to his character, there's noble qualities, there's ignoble qualities. And as regards the latter, here we have lack of responsibility, we have womanizing, dangerous womanizing, we have drinking, and we have just this sort of cavalier attitude. And again, he's 19 years old. Those traits stay with him till the day he dies. And the inability to make money also. I mean, he's basically in perpetual debt from the age of 20 until he's put in the ground. Spends every penny he earns, and then some. It's quite extraordinary.
But he does have some qualities that one often looks for in intelligence officers, or at least intelligence officers who engage in collection, as opposed to what I did, sitting behind a desk and writing things. He's very good at languages, as you noted. And it also, I was really struck in your book about the remarkable skill that he seemed to have, schmoozing with more or less anybody. So hold that thought. I was amused to learn that after the war, if I recall correctly, he was, before the war, he was offered a position with MI6, which he turned down. So one, I'm curious if you have any ideas on why he didn't want to do that. That seemed to me like, oh, great, I get to get back in the game again.
I think the responsibility that came with that was somewhat of a deterrent. Lockhart was always involved in intelligence without having to be an intelligence officer, and I think that's the way he liked it. He had friends in the intelligence services, he had friends in the military, he had friends in the government, he had friends all over the place, as you say. Everyone from Trotsky, who he's quite chummy with until he tries to usurp him from power, right through to Anthony Eden, Beaverbrook. He's palling around with Oswald Mosley, who's going to become the leader of the British Union of Fascists for a time. The thing that was so fascinating about him, and the thing that was so engaging and kept me going in the research, was that in an age of extremes where everyone is becoming either a communist or a fascist, basically, he is close to being a political agnostic. He doesn't judge too much. When you're a man with his vices, you can't afford to judge. He is open to talking to anyone. He likes a good story. He's gregarious, and as you say, these are invaluable qualities for a spy. The ability to get through to someone, to have them open up to you, to charm them. And in terms of the collection part of the cycle, he's excellent. Operationally, not so much.
Well, just a quick follow-up to that, and then maybe we can turn to questions from the audience. And I may jump in again further, but so imagine he was still with us, and he sends in an application to MI6. Do you think MI6 would hire him? Do you think MI6 should hire him? Today's MI6 in today's world.
I think they should, but they wouldn't. I'm old school.
Explain.
I'm a human guy. I like the man on the spot, or the woman on the spot, or whoever you can get on the spot, who knows the terrain, who knows the people, who has the je ne sais quoi to acquire information. I think that's an invaluable component of intelligence. I think it always will be. He exemplifies that. Yes, the plot was a mistake, but that's because it was a details thing. It was an experience thing. It was an operational capacity thing. He doesn't have any of that. He's not trained. None of these people are trained. Sidney Riley wasn't trained. He's self-taught master spy, right? We're only a couple of years on from the founding of MI5 and MI6. It's all amateur hour. And I think today, if he came with that resume to MI6, I don't know. He had a knack of making friends in high places. Maybe someone would help him out. But if it's based on his character qualities alone, I think he might be judged to be not sound.
Fair enough.
Politely.
So, Amanda, am I correct that if people here have questions, they should line up over there?
And I have some good ones
Yes, go for
already
it.
from online. Make your way over there. Don't be intimidated. But we had one that came in very early when you were talking about the Cheka records, and this guest wanted to know, did you consider the fact that they might be crafted?
Oh, they were. It's not a consideration. They were. The Russian version of events is fascinating, actually. So originally, the Russian version is that Lockhart is involved, deeply involved, master spy, deeply involved in this plot, and it's this enormous conspiracy involving every Westerner in Russia, basically. Stop me if any of this feels eerily familiar, but it's the West are against us. They want to destroy us, etc., etc. And that's the narrative. Now that changes over time. And it's quite fascinating how it changes. When Stalin comes to power, Stalin, as you know, not a massive fan of Leon Trotsky, and is aware that...
We have an axe in this museum.
Yes, I saw that yesterday, and I was fascinating. I didn't know you had that. It's so cool. And when Stalin comes to power, they know that Lockhart was mates with Trotsky for a time. He got, of all the Bolsheviks, with the exception of perhaps Karl Radek, he got along best with Trotsky. And so the narrative switches to, well, Trotsky was involved in the plot. He was in with all the Western traitors. It was the Trotsky plot and all that. So the Russian version of events mutates over time, which anyone who knows anything about Russia and its history and its intelligence services, this will not be a surprise. It mutates based on context. And he's one of the first victims of that, where his story changes on the Russian side quite a bit. But he's always the central character. He's always the locus of the wider conspiracy. And what's fascinating about that to the point of the question, that the records are doctored. Yes, the details are doctored, but there's a fascinating document, a letter sent by Lockhart in his dotage to his son Robin. It's around about 1962, 63, something like that. And in it, he says to Robin, well, the Russian version is basically the truth, right? He doesn't go into details of what's true and what's not. He says it's basically the truth. So there you go.
That's wonderful.
Before we turn to a question from the illustrious FBI historian John Fox, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that very near the Riley box in our covert action gallery is the ice axe that was used to assassinate Trotsky. Sorry, that's a commercial from me. All right, John Fox.
And there's an excellent lecture on YouTube by Keith Melton about finding that axe.
Is it?
I'm going to get a little esoteric. So in the first season of Monty Python, they did a sketch about the Killing Joke,
Yes.
where the propaganda folks in World War II came up with this joke that was so funny that people died laughing. They translate it into German, and they send it out to the troops and have these soldiers marching in line reading to the Germans hiding in the forest, and you hear people starting to and fall over dead. That's obviously in the mid to late 70s. And it's around the time when a lot of stuff about covert operations and intelligence in World War II are starting to come out, Masterman and Double Cross and Ultra and so forth. Did they get an inkling of that from Bruce's life?
They being the Pythons?
Yes, the Python.
That's
That's an interesting.
That is a good one, and I have no evidence for this, but I'm going to say yes. It sounds it's quite plausible. So I'm going to have to do a deep dive into this now, because I'm trying to think when the first season of Python ran, because his diaries
Can
first
somebody
published.
look that up while we're talking? Actually, seriously. Go ahead.
He dies in 1970s. Diaries are published. Actually, I don't think the dates line up, because the diaries are not published because they have to redact a hell of a lot of stuff out of his diaries before they publish them. Not necessarily secret stuff. He's quite catty about certain rather important figures, and he does give away quite a few, because a lot of these diaries are composed after he's spent a night drinking whiskey, so it's all very candid. But he also has a lot of stuff in there about psyops, which we're in the middle of the Cold War. You don't want that stuff getting out, so there is some real stuff in there that they classify. But no, I don't think the diaries would have been out before Python. But there was knowledge of PWE before then as well. You had some other chaps who had written their memoirs prior to Robert Bruce Lockhart's diaries. Lockhart himself writes a post-Second World War memoir, one of the 12 books he writes of varying quality. But the one he writes after the war, Comes the Reckoning, that's what it's called. He does talk about PWE in there, and he does talk about some of its eccentricities, but the details of some of the things they come up with, some of the rumors they come up with, and how silly they are, I don't think he gets into into the weeds too much with that. But I'll put it this way: if the Pythons had access to the records of PWE, then yes, they would have drawn inspiration. Because in there,
We are getting so much data in the Q&A about
Okay.
when the first Monty Python was 5 October 1969. We're getting a lot of info.
Okay.
Yep. We have some fans.
plot thickens. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, okay.
That's
I'm going to follow up on this. You've won the night there, John. That's a good one.
John deserves acknowledgement in your next paper when
does,
you
he
publish on
does.
this question. It's a crossover. Amanda, I've got another question for him, but go ahead if you've got good ones
okay.
on the
I'll
line.
ask one. You ask. This one's Woburn Abbey. Where is it? Is it open to the public?
These days, I mean, it's a stately home, and the propagandists were housed in sort of outbuildings. I think it's National Trust owned, so you probably have to pay a hell of a lot of money to go in and ooh and ah at how wonderful it is and how nice the gardens are.
Is it north, south?
It's south, so it's in Bedfordshire, it's sort of Heartlands. It's about maybe about 45 minutes. Actually, with traffic, it's probably more like an hour and a half outside of London. But yeah, in the middle of the countryside, nice place. And it was there for secrecy. So the idea was, if you put them out there outside London, no one's going to know what they're doing. But the inverse of that is, they didn't know what the hell was going on either, because they're not in the nerve centers where all the diplomats are, where all the gossip is, where all the stuff's happening in London, and that's why they're up there, having a party and just partying.
Since you mentioned PWE several times here, due to that question, what were Robert Bruce Lockhart's sort of views on PWE's strategy? I think if I understood your book, he found it a little sort of unguided and unfocused when he took over. What was his thoughts on, like, really, what are we trying to do with this, and what is the best way to do it?
Well, this is where I think he made a pretty significant contribution to PSYOPs, in that he understood that propaganda is basically useless without truth or some kernel of truth to it. He understood the concept, at least, that the best lies are told with truths, attached to them. And his problem was that the ideas were scattergun. So you've got rumors being developed by PWE these are rumors that are meant to be spread in the occupied territories to undermine German morale, yeah? So you got stuff like, you got good things, like there was one about, there's a typhus outbreak amongst the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, which was conceivable because they were out there without good gear, it's horrible conditions, so it makes sense. And so you spread that amongst the families of the troops back home, and you know the deal. But then there's other stuff that's not so convincing, where there was a rumor that they spread in 1941, I think it was, that the British government had imported 200 sharks from Australia to be released in the English Channel, with the idea that this would scare the Wehrmacht, who would be scared to get on landing craft to invade Britain because they might fall over and be eaten. Nonsense.
That does sound kind of Python-esque.
Yeah, it's very. I mean, again, this. If they had access to the records, this might have proved the inspiration. So when Lockhart comes in, he realizes that this kind of just throwing stuff out there isn't going to work, and what he conceives of is a strategy of basically trying to boost morale in the occupied territories until such time as Allied boots can be on the ground, because it's only then that you can start pushing the narrative. And to his mind, this is the only narrative that you can push to the German people, is that Hitler has failed you. At some point, this is going to end, and it's going to end badly for you all. And so he's saying, we can't do that when we haven't landed in Europe or North Africa or anywhere. We can't do that when we're on the defensive. Once we start landing troops, then we can start telling the Germans, your time is up and you need to figure out what you're doing about Hitler. And that's why PWE doesn't really start cranking until the end of 1942, after the Operation Torch landings in North Africa. And that's when Lockhart first meets Eisenhower. And Eisenhower's like, I love this PSYOP stuff. This is great. Let's do more of it. They get along really well.
Sorry, I didn't see what somebody heard.
In-person question.
Hello. I was just wondering if throughout your research you had ever found something in his memoirs where you realized, this was always accepted as truth, but actually it just came from him in terms of history of the First World, in terms of the Cold War, things like that, and being like, you thought this happened, but it was from him.
The main one off the top of my head is, as I say, the V for Victory campaign, and the fact that he's presiding over that, and that so many people think that that's just some sort of random gesture that came up. There's a really good myth that develops about how, if I remember it correctly, about how the Germans were going to kidnap the Pope. I think that was a rumor that came around. Someone actually wrote a book about it as if it was a legit thing, that this was a plot, and it was a PWE fabrication. It was fake news basically that became a historical fact, and there's myriad other examples of that where there's just these little things. So the rumor, here's one, which is often traced to PWE. And again, I don't know if Lockhart himself is the author of this. A lot of times he was serving more as the editor of the more vibrant imaginations of the people around him. But the song that all the soldiers used to sing, Hitler has only got one ball. The idea that Hitler has one testicle, it's a rumor spread by PWE. So that's one.
I guess the last question from me.
Oh, wait, I got one online.
Go for it. Go for it.
Okay, I'll do that, and then you can ask.
All right.
Okay.
Sounds
okay.
great.
All right. This is a question about whether the fictionalization of intelligence history, such as the Riley Ace of Spies and Lockhart's own memoirs, have they become too embedded in public consciousness to overcome through more serious scholarship such as yours? And I'm going to go ahead and say you could say no, not if you buy my book, but you might have another answer.
See, I don't know about that. I think that there's room for both things. I mean, this museum is a testament to the fact you've got a Bond exhibition on right now, right? I think that the being liberal with the truth of the intelligence world, I think it has its merits. I think that it's not just entertainment. I think that it is just part of the zeitgeist, the way that people understand intelligence. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, to be honest. Quite apart from the fact that it obscures what actually goes on, which is no bad thing. So yeah, I think there's room for both. I don't personally have a problem. I am an academic. I'm employed by a university, but I am certainly not turning my nose up to the idea that there's room for more narrative, sort of exciting histories about this stuff, because it lends itself to that. History is a good story, and the stories, particularly in intelligence, are there in abundance. So go write them.
Yeah, no, I sort of feel like there are probably a lot of people who pursued intelligence either just as something they wanted to read about throughout their lives, or as a career, or to become historians for that matter, who might have used Riley Ace of Spies as sort of their point of entree, their gateway drug, if you will. Yeah. Kind of like Herbert Yardley's book, American Black Chamber, which is not particularly reliable, but got people like David Kahn and any number of NSA employees interested in codes.
Exactly. And this stuff, it serves at its base level, it serves as inspiration. That's no bad thing.
My last question, and forgive me, it's not directly about Lockhart, but what do we know about sort of the what's the end to Mara's story? She really struck me. I feel like in a lot of ways her story is, their story is really quite sad. What happened to her?
It's sad, but it's also beautiful. So they reunite in 1924. After the plot, she is kept in Russia for a time. She can't really leave for a variety of reasons. She's eventually got a passport through her husband. They're both married when they have this affair, by the way. I didn't mention that detail, but it stands to reason with Lockhart. She gets an Estonian passport off the man she marries, which incidentally is where she gets the title Baroness Budberg. She marries a quite eccentric, quite mad, actually, Estonian count who goes off to South America and dies, I think, trying to find, lost city of Zed or something. And she gets a passport, is able to get out of Russia. She reunites with Lockhart. He tries to rekindle the flame. She says, nope, we ain't doing that. But they remain lifelong friends. Companions is actually what I'd call them. They are each other's muse, each other's confidant. She weaves in and out of his life. She goes on to her MI5 file is fascinating, to the point about the narrative of spies and the sensationalism. Read her MI5 file, and you feel like you're reading a movie, because according to MI5, at various points in Muir's life, she spies for the Russians, she spies for the French, she spies for the Germans against the French, she spies for the British, she spies for the Russians against the British. And all of this could possibly be true, but we don't know, because she was perhaps a bit brighter than Lockhart. She burnt all of her papers before she died. So we don't know.
So MI6 should hire her too.
Yeah, well, she tries. I mean, she's actually screened. It's MI6 who actually give her the go-ahead to work for. She ends up working for Charles de Gaulle's propaganda department during the war. But she initially applies to MI5, and they're like, "No, we can't have you. You're sketchy as hell. Go somewhere else." But she is always involved in intelligence, and she's always involved with Lockhart. And this was what I was telling you about at the end of the book. I'll just spoil it for you. But she is there right at the end. She outlives him, which again is astonishing, because she really didn't look after herself. She could drink him under the table, which was no small feat. Astonishing. In her MI5 file, actually, it remarked, astonishing quantities of gin this woman can drink. Important information. But she's there at the end. When he dies, he's given a Catholic funeral in Brighton, where he dies on the south coast of England. And she says, "No, I'm not having any of that." She hires out a church in Kensington in London, which has always had a large Eastern European Russian diaspora. It's not far from the Russian embassy, actually. And she hires out a Russian Orthodox church, and she convenes a one-woman funeral for him, and she stands there and lights a candle to his memory. So she's, she loved him to the end, and I dare say he loved her till the end.
Thank you very much, Amanda.
Wow, well, that is quite a sentimental and moving image to close on. This has been James. This has been just riveting. So great. Mark, thank you for your excellent questions and this wonderful audience. If you're online, I can encourage you to buy James' book online from our store. So thanks everyone so much, and have a great evening.
Thank you.